The history books describe them as the terror of the ancient world, mounted archers who appeared from the eastern horizon without warning, who burned cities and vanished back into the endless grass before armies could be assembled to meet them. The Greeks wrote about them with a mixture of fascination and fear. The Persians sent armies against them and watched those armies dissolve into the steppe. The Assyrians paid them tribute. Even the Chinese built walls, in part because of what came from the direction of their steppe frontier. For 2,500 years, the Scythians have been defined by what their enemies said about them. A single, coherent people, a unified mounted warrior culture stretching from the Black Sea to the borders of China, gold-drunk and fearless, drinking wine from the skulls of their enemies, tattooed and wild, the archetypal barbarian at the gate. This is the Scythian of popular imagination. This is the Scythian of the textbooks. The DNA tells a different story, and the story it tells is not simpler. It is not neater. It is considerably stranger, considerably more human, and considerably more important for everything we think we know about how the ancient Eurasian steppe shaped the world we live in. To understand what the ancient DNA revealed about the Scythians, you first need to understand what we thought we knew. The Scythians emerged as a recognizable archaeological culture in the 8th century BCE, associated with distinctive burial practices, weaponry, and above all a style of animal art, the Scythian animal style, whose swirling predatory imagery appears in gold and bronze from the Danube to the Altai Mountains. Ancient Greek sources, particularly Herodotus, describe them as a coherent ethnic group, the Scythians, with their own language, their own customs, their own religious practices, and a specific origin story involving their mythological ancestor Scythes, son of Heracles, and a serpent woman, in the land north of the Black Sea. This description of the Scythians as a single people with a defined homeland was enormously influential on subsequent scholarship. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists working across the Eurasian steppe debated which modern ethnic group the Scythians were most closely related to, whether their language was an ancestor of modern Iranian, whether their physical type matched particular modern populations. The debate assumed that there was a single answer, a single ancestral population, a single genetic origin behind the Scythian cultural phenomenon. The ancient DNA does not support this assumption, and what it suggests instead is something that changes not just the story of the Scythians, but our entire understanding of how the Eurasian steppe worked as a system. The landmark study of Scythian genetics was published in 2018 in the journal Science Advances, led by researchers including Wolfgang Hock at the Max Planck Institute and a large international team of collaborators working with ancient skeletal material from across the full geographic range of the Scythian cultural world, from Ukraine in the west to the Altai Mountains in the east. The study analyzed ancient genomes from 111 individuals spanning the Scythian period, roughly 700 to 200 BCE, drawn from burial sites across this enormous territory. The results delivered a finding that fundamentally disrupted the single people model. The Scythians, genetically, were not one population, they were several. The Western Scythians, those buried in the great kurgans of the Pontic steppe north of the Black Sea, the ones that Herodotus had personally visited and described, showed a genetic profile dominated by Eastern European steppe ancestry, closely related to the earlier Yamnaya and their successors, mixed with moderate proportions of ancestry from the Caucasus and ancient Iran. The Eastern Scythians, those from the Altai and eastern Kazakhstan, showed a dramatically different ancestry profile, with substantial proportions of East Asian-related ancestry alongside the steppe component, reflecting the different population history of the eastern steppe. In between these two poles, across thousands of miles of grassland, the picture was not a gradient from one population to another, it was a mosaic. Individual burial sites showed combinations of ancestry components that varied enormously from one kurgan to the next. The genetic data suggested that what we call Scythian was not a population at all. It was a culture, a way of life, a shared set of practices and artistic conventions and military technologies that spread across the steppe and was adopted by multiple distinct genetic populations who shared the same mobile pastoralist economy and the same answer to the question of how to survive and thrive on the grass ocean of inner Eurasia. This finding has implications that reach well beyond the specific question of Scythian origins, because it means that the steppe, for thousands of years, functioned as something different from what we had imagined. Not a barrier, not a highway used by a single people moving in one direction, but a network, a connected system of mobile populations that were genetically diverse, that mixed and separated, and mixed again in patterns too complex for any simple origin story to capture, but that maintained enough cultural coherence to present, to outsiders and to themselves, a recognizable shared identity. The Scythian animal style, the swirling gold, the predatory imagery that appears from the Danube to the Altai, was the cultural expression of this network, not the art of one people, but a shared visual language, adopted across an enormous territory by populations who shared an economy and an ecology, but not necessarily a common genetic ancestry. The art traveled faster and further than the genes did. The identity traveled faster than the biology. This is a pattern that the ancient DNA revolution has now documented in multiple contexts across the ancient world, and the Scythians are one of the clearest examples of it. Culture and genes do not always move together. A way of life can spread across populations who are genetically diverse, creating shared identity through shared practice rather than shared descent. But there is a further layer to the Scythian story that the genetics reveals, one that connects directly to the lives of people living today across Eurasia, from Eastern Europe to the Korean Peninsula. The Scythian period, roughly 700 to 200 BCE, corresponds to an era of intense population mixing across the steppe. The 2018 study and subsequent research have shown that during this period, gene flow between eastern and western steppe populations was running in both directions simultaneously. Western steppe populations were acquiring East Asian ancestry. Eastern steppe populations were acquiring European steppe ancestry. The steppe was not a barrier between the genetic worlds of Eastern and Western Eurasia. It was the zone where those worlds were continuously mixing, separating, remixing, producing combinations that then moved outward in all directions. The descendants of the Scythian period steppe populations are not confined to any single modern ethnic group. They are distributed, in varying proportions, across the populations of Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Mongolia, and parts of Iran and China. The Scythian genetic legacy is not a single thread running through history. It is a web, spread across the modern populations of the Eurasian heartland, contributing to the ancestry of hundreds of millions of people who have no idea that a portion of their genome traces back to the swirling gold and the mounted archers of the ancient steppe. There is one population whose relationship to the Scythians has attracted particular scientific and public attention: the modern Ossetians of the North Caucasus, who speak the only surviving Iranian language indigenous to the former Scythian heartland, have long been proposed as the closest modern descendants of the Western Scythians. The ancient DNA provides partial support for this claim. The Ossetians do show genetic continuity with the ancient Pontic steppe populations that the Western Scythians belong to, but they are also heavily admixed with populations from the Caucasus, from the Near East, and from later steppe migrations. They are not simply Scythians surviving into the modern world. They are what happened to Scythian ancestry over 2,500 years of subsequent mixing, which is to say, they are a complicated, layered, very human result. The burial practices of the Scythians offer a window into the human world behind the warrior reputation. The great kurgans of the Pontic steppe, some of them rising to the height of a 4-story building, contain not just warriors but families. Men buried with their horses and their weapons, yes, but also women buried with equal or greater elaboration. Gold diadems on their heads, mirrors and spindles in their hands, sometimes weapons as well, graves that archaeologists once assumed belonged to male warriors, until the skeletal analysis revealed the bones of women. This is where the DNA intersects with something that changes the entire cultural picture. The Scythian women buried with weapons and horses, the finds that inspired the Greek legends of the Amazons, have now been studied genetically. A comprehensive 2019 study found that approximately 1/3 of the weapon-bearing Scythian burials in the Pontic steppe belonged to women. These were not anomalies. They were not exceptions. They were a systematic feature of Scythian society. The women who rode and fought and were buried with the same equipment as the men were doing so as a regular part of Scythian social life, not as rare exceptions, but as representatives of a social organization in which women participated in mounted warfare to a degree that had no parallel in the ancient Mediterranean world. Herodotus had written about Amazon warriors. His Greek audience had treated this as exotic mythology. The ancient DNA and the archaeological evidence together now suggest that what he was describing, however filtered through Greek assumptions, was a real observation. The warrior women of the steppe were not a legend. They were a demographic reality, encoded in the burial record, visible in the bone and confirmed by the genome. Here is what the full picture of the Scythians reveals, and why it matters, beyond one ancient culture. The Scythians have always been used as a mirror. Every generation that encountered them, from the ancient Greeks to 19th century nationalists to 21st century identity politicians, has found in the Scythians what it wanted to find: a pure race, or a dangerous other, or a noble ancestor, or a terrifying enemy. The Scythians as a concept has been more useful to various projects of identity making than the Scythians as they actually were. What the ancient DNA gives us is the Scythians as they actually were. Not a single people, not a pure origin, not a coherent ethnic group in any modern sense of the term, but a cultural system, a way of life, a shared identity built not on blood but on practice, on economy, on the shared experience of living on the steppe and using it as a world rather than simply crossing it. The men and women buried in those kurgans were genetically diverse. They came from different ancestral populations. They mixed across the steppe in patterns that no single narrative can fully capture. And they shared an identity anyway, expressed in gold and horses, and the angular animal imagery that still strikes us across 25 centuries as unmistakably, powerfully itself. If the Scythians teach us anything, it is that identity has never required genetic homogeneity. The most powerful cultural identities in human history have almost always been built on diversity, on the meeting and mixing of populations whose shared practices and shared values created coherence out of biological variety. The steppe did this on a continental scale across 1,000 years. The DNA found the diversity. The gold showed us the coherence. Together, they show us something about what human identity actually is, and has always been, underneath the stories we tell about where we came from. The steppe is still there. The grass still moves in the wind from the Black Sea to the Altai. The kurgans still rise above the horizon in Ukraine and Kazakhstan, most of them still unopened, still holding whatever the people inside them carried when they were placed in the earth. Each one a data point in a story that the science is still assembling, still refining, still surprising itself with. The Scythians were never what we thought, because what we thought was simpler, purer, and less interesting than what they actually were. What they actually were is a lesson that the ancient world left buried in the Eurasian steppe, in gold and bone and genome, waiting for a science patient enough to read all three at once. History is not written in the stories nations tell about themselves. It is written in the ground, in the gold, in the genome. And what it says about the Scythians, it says about all of us. We are the products of mixing and movement, and the slow accumulation of ancestry from people we will never know. We carry in ourselves the genetic record of encounters that no historian documented. And the steppe, that vast connected world that gave the Scythians their stage, gave all of us something too, a reminder that the boundaries we draw around peoples and identities are younger and thinner and more provisional than the earth beneath our feet.